Great. Well, welcome back. I'm going to invite Michel Thiry now to join me in the stream. Hi, Michel.
Hi, Jonathan. Hi, everybody.
Good. Let me
Everybody is
introduce.
really energized today. I love
Yeah, indeed. Let me introduce you. We were talking about power apps and things, and I kind of feel that in order to do justice to your accomplishments, I almost need a dashboard or a power app, Michel, because you have done so much. You have extensive worldwide experience of working in many cultural environments. You're recognized as a worldwide authority in the strategic applications of project, program, agile, and value at organizational level, and you've supported the development and the implementation of numerous strategic change programs. You've written and lectured widely, 27 PMI global congresses, multiple keynotes at PMI chapter annual conferences, and you sat on expert panels in both international academic and practitioner forums. You're a PMI fellow, you're a fellow of the Association for Project Management, you have a Life Achievement Award from the Canadian Society of Value Analysis, you've won the PMI Eric Jennett Project Management Excellence Award. You've done it all, and including, I'm pleased to say, writing a book for me over 13 years ago, which was your wonderful book on program management, which I know, has gone to a second edition. So, Michel, welcome. I'm looking forward to
Yeah,
hearing you talk about radical program management.
thank you. And you may not know, but the book has been translated in Chinese and Korean recently.
Excellent.
So yeah, I mean, this makes me sound very old. Um, but Jonathan, do you bring the screen share, the slides? Okay, good. Right. Okay. Well, it seems we have a little technical problem. Okay, why radical programs? Well, for many years, as Jonathan has said, over 30 years, I've worked in program management and participated in the reviewing of different standards, including the PMI standard, managing successful programs, and the Japanese standard P2M. But I've realized over time that program standards and program practice cover only part of the area that is included in what we do in the world. And an area that is not covered is when we're in high ambiguity and high uncertainty areas. And over the last few years, maybe 5-6 years, I've started thinking of, okay, what do we do then? And I've called that radical programs. The word radical comes from Mintzberg, Henry Mintzberg's work on radical decision making when the situation is really confusing, complex, etc. How do we make decisions? And so I borrowed the term from radical from Mintzberg, and I've called that radical programs. So today I'm going to see. Sorry, I'm going to go to the right place. Okay, I'm going to see a little bit in terms of the agenda. What is a radical program? Then why do we need radical programs? Why are we talking about them, and why today? And what are the I would say good practices or practices that we can things we can apply to manage radical programs if ever we can manage them, and then go to a conclusion. So that it's a fairly simple presentation. Shouldn't be too long, but I'm going to try to challenge you a little bit. I'm going to try to make you think about your own situation, how you would handle a certain number of situations in your work or outside of your work if you're participating as a volunteer in crisis and charities and things like that, about what you would do in a radical situation. So if we start with what is a radical program, typically radical programs come from situations that are at the edge of chaos, as is known in complexity theory, or in chaos. They can be man-made or natural. We're thinking of war, economic crisis, climate emergency, political turmoil, and physical things like earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, wildfires, pandemics. The characteristic of these situations is that they're highly volatile and complex. If you think of the term VUCA, the volatility and uncertainty are at their a fairly high point, and the ambiguity and complexity also. Complexity means that there is a lot of interrelationships, interactions that we cannot control. There are a lot of relationships that need to happen, and that we don't know what's going to happen. It requires making constant decisions on a regular basis, continually have to choose between different paths, different avenues. Volatility usually means that things are moving very fast and they're changing very fast. So you don't have time to collect data, to do a proper analysis, to make a rational decision. You're actually caught to make decisions without having the data. So you make decisions based on intuition. You have to take a higher risk because risks are linked to uncertainty, and the higher the uncertainty, the higher the risk. So the risk you're taking is higher. So this is the characteristic basically of those situations. And the consequences, obviously, we've heard since this morning, are that you will have refugees, you will have homelessness, you will have famine, poverty, instability, and these are long-term effects of a crisis. It's not just about we're having it today, we're treating the crisis today, but also we're having it in the longer term. So the question here is, what then is a radical program? So programs are typically adaptive and typically will enable us to manage more complex and volatile situations than projects, typically longer term, more complex, more strategic, organizational level where there's more of a behavioral issues or cultural issues, and programs deal with that. Programs, in fact, should generate benefits. So programs beyond the delivery of a product, of an outcome, they should deliver benefits. Okay? And one thing that's important to understand is that benefits, contrarily to an outcome is something that's rational, that's measurable. You can measure the outcome. We've increased production by 10%, for example. That's an outcome. Now, the benefit is, will that increase in production help us get a bigger market share, for example? Well, if the market is not ready, if your product has not been well marketed, if you don't have the right logistics in place, it will not. And therefore, the benefit really has to take into account the context. And that's one thing that program does a lot as compared to projects, for example. Now, radical programs will help us make sense and master these extreme situations. Sense making is a very important aspect of program management. The whole work of Kinnuin is based on the concept of sense making. People like Carl Weick have written about it. The need for people to be able to make sense before they accept a change. And one of the big issues with crisis situations is that people are surprised by the situation and they don't know how to make sense of it, and we have to give them time. But it's a case where we don't have time. We have to do something very quickly. So radical programs are characterized by an intense complexity and ambiguity, and the need to make frequent decisions to respond quickly to change without necessarily having all the data we need to make that decision. Very high volatility and uncertainty, so the need to continually assimilate new data and act on it very quickly without having really time to process it. And you need to find a novel combination of structures, methodologies, and behaviors, things that you have never done before, or things that you repurpose, that you've used in one situation, you need to repurpose for this situation. So a broad understanding of the context, a broad understanding of tools and techniques, a broad understanding of methods and methodologies is very important if you want to manage radical programs. So what are the abilities of a radical program manager? Well, Some of them is to trust your intuition, to be able to react quickly. Don't wait to get all the data, all the information to react. Be creative. Think divergently. Think, well, I don't like the outside the box metaphor, but think outside the box. Think in a different way. Start thinking, not just, break down barriers. Think, how would I do that if this, for example, was not the case? So, and allow people in your teams who have divergent ideas to express them. Give them room to do that. Understand the context. I talked about it earlier. In order to generate benefits, we need to understand the context. So perceive the patterns. Complexity is characterized by patterns. If you go into the detail, it's difficult, but you see the bigger picture. You see patterns appearing, and that's what you have to be able to perceive as a radical program manager. And then have a good capacity for challenge. Don't fear to challenge the established order, to challenge the existing structures, to challenge the existing rules. Break the rules. Don't hesitate for that. There is a situation, it's an emergency, it's something that is radical. You have no prior history, no historical data. I mean, in project management, we always talk about historical data. There's no historical data here. So you have to sometimes break the rules to make it work. And take risks, look for opportunities, make sure that you have, sorry, I'm just trying to eliminate this little black box at the bottom. Okay, sorry, I'm going back, one, okay. Okay, anyway, look for opportunities. I mean, when we talk about risk, we often talk about threats, but here we have to look for opportunities. I like talking about risk optimization instead of risk management, because a risk, as described in the PMBOK guide, is both a threat or an opportunity. But if we think in terms of risk management, we always think of sitting back and managing something that happens. Whereas here we're saying, okay, how do you create opportunities out of the uncertainty? How can you create positive aspects? And by the way, I put this picture in because I read an interesting story about a blind surfer, a man who became blind when he was like 6 or 7, and his father decided to teach him to surf. And he's now surfing, and he's only listening to the sound of the waves and feeling things and the feeling he gets in his feet. And he surfs blind waves like that one, which nor I or many of us could surf. So it means that you have to rely more on your senses, on your intuition, and forget about the rational thinking. Now, I wanted to put this quote from Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Muhammad Ali Jinnah is the first president of Pakistan. He was a lawyer in India when it was still an English colony, and he was against the partition of India into Muslim and Hindu countries. But when it did happen, when he saw he had no choice, he fought for Pakistan and basically created Pakistan as we know it today, or almost, because now Bangladesh is independent from Pakistan. But he said, I do not believe in taking the right decision. I take a decision and make it right. And I think that's very important if you're a radical program manager. You have to make decisions without knowing if it's right or wrong, but you work to make it right in the end. And I think it's a very important aspect that we need to take into account. So, why do we need radical program management? Oh, yeah, I've talked about what it is, but why do we need it? Why are we here talking about it? Well, in the past, prehistoric tribes were constantly restructuring their organizational systems in regards of the context. There's a very interesting book that has been published recently, The History of Everything, and it's about how organizations were initiated, and the authors look at the history of societies in different parts of the world, and how they are different. Some are democracies, some were dictatorships, some were oligarchies, some were hierarchical, some were less hierarchical. And what they have identified is that it's much more, and they could live side by side, a very democratic society and a very dictatorial society. And it depended very much on the circumstances, but also how people felt themselves. So radical transformation are both, when the behavioral change and the structural changes are high. And that means it's not new to human beings. We've always been that since, prehistoric tribes going on a hunt or something. Things were changing continually, the weather, the way the herds moves, things like that. And it's even the Greeks were quite adaptive. But then in the Roman time, we started thinking that as human beings, we can control the world around us. And the Romans built huge roads, they organized society and all that. Most of the things we live by today, the law, the structures, the sewerage systems, things like that, come from the Romans. So we have this impression today that we can control the world completely. We can put it under control. Radical programs are designed to embrace the flow and create resonance. Resonance means that for a minimum effort, you create a maximum effect. And so the idea is that today we're faced again with technology, a technology revolution where it becomes again very complicated. We can't control it. We can't control technology. Very few people can. And so how do we deal with that? So how do you manage chaos with a radical program? Well, as a leader, you have to challenge the status quo. You have to also create a good base, create a strong base of people who agree with you, of people who share your vision, who share your approach. Create motivation based on deep aspirations, because the surface is not sufficient. It's too shallow. You have to go, with deep people's aspiration. And in terms of strategy, you have to have distributed decisions, empower your team, allow them to make decisions, give them room, but you have to have clear values that are shared within the team, and you have to focus on what brings value to your stakeholders, because that's how you're going to succeed. Now, I'm going to use here a quote from Vladimir Zelensky. He said, "I'm not a politician. I'm just a simple person who has come to break down the system. I'm the type of person who responds to facts." And we know today that he is handling a crisis situation, in fact, a radical program, fairly well. He's applying all the things that I talked about earlier, delegating, creating networks, creating a deep motivation value, things like that. So the next step is, okay, well, how can we do, what are the practical things I can do about radical programs? What are the practices I should have? So, one of the things we want to do is take ideas, some people call it exaptive, for example, or ear bones come from jaw bones from the reptiles, and they migrated to become the ear bones, and it allows us to hear better. That's called exaptive adaptation. And it means we repurpose something that exists already into another function. So I thought for a long time, rewilding has been more and more popular, especially in the UK and in Europe and in America. And, it means playing with nature and trying to bring nature back into places that have not seen it for a while. So what are the things that they apply? They work in an adaptive co-management process where people manage as a team. they share ideas, and they adapt continually. One of the important things is social license. How are you perceived by society? Does society accept? Is it acceptable what you do? Try to develop trusting relationships with local and other participants. And finally, have a good network structure. So a core team that's harmonizing between multiple stakeholders to address the diversity of views. Different people will have different views. You have to address that. You can't just say, oh no, sorry, we're not doing this, we're doing that. And transparent governance processes. So if we look at it from a graphical point of view, how do you do that? And this is basically what we did for this conference. I mean, a month ago, there was no conference. I got a phone call from Olivier Lazare at PMI, and he said, Michel, can you help us organize it? Last year, you did a conference, you created PM for the World. Can you help us organize a conference for Turkey? And that's where it all started. Then I called a few other people, and the whole thing blossomed into what you see today. So it all starts with chaos. And this is the Greek for chaos, because chaos is originally Greek. And then you find catalysts, you find people like Guillaume Lapierre, like Merv, like Jose, like Liz, who have good knowledge of their area. And then these people find other people. But what we do first is we create a strong mission, a vision, a value. We create a team that will uphold that view and create harmony in the whole thing so that we don't go all over the place. And then you extend your network. You create smaller networks. You delegate to these people so they can do things. And basically, you respect the fact that some decisions will be taken locally over which you have no control as a program manager. You also encourage new ideas. In the panel, they talked about special skills that people have, like speaking a language. You know, for example, if you send 8 people that come to aid from America, and they arrive in Turkey, they don't speak Turkish. So you have to have people who speak both English and Turkish to be able to help. The skills, like Omar was saying, he helps people in the Alps, cross the Alps, but he's a mountaineer. He does mountaineering, so he can help. He can use his own skill. He was talking about the lawyers who go there. Use your skills and allow these new ideas to emerge, and then acknowledge diversity. Acknowledge the fact that there will be different people with different backgrounds, with different things that will make decisions that you would not necessarily have thought of, or you would not necessarily have made yourself. But you have to accept that and let it happen. You know, Mintzberg said the best way to manage change is to let it happen. And finally, build trust, acknowledge diversity, and make sure you have transparent governing. The other thing we have to do is continually test and reassess. Mike Goodhand, who was the head at the moment of British Red Cross disaster recovery in the UK, one day I asked him, well, how do you do in a crisis situation? He said, Michel, if you can't measure accurately, measure frequently. So you have to continually measure and assess if you're doing the right thing. If not, change. If yes, continue. So one interesting thing is how do we deal, as a manager, what kind of efforts do you put in there? Well, the thing is that you have to look at the value, the highest value. Well, if you look at the achievability of the solution and the alignment with objectives, something that has high alignment and high achievability is of high value. So if it has low achievability and low alignment, do not waste effort on that. Eliminate it as quickly as possible. Now, if you have something that has high value and high achievability, well, yes, go for it, but delegate. Don't waste effort as a leader. Don't waste effort on that. Give it to somebody to do. It's easy. It's achievable. It's aligned. Now, where you have to put the least effort also is when it's very well aligned, but less achievable, because achievability is something that can be worked out fairly easily. Where you have to put the most effort is in this case, where things are highly achievable and therefore very tempting to do because they're achievable, they're easy to do, but they don't align very well with your objectives. And therefore, you have to kill it, or you have to give effort to say, okay, how can we increase the alignment? And if not, go for it. So as a leader, the greatest effort you should put is there to stop things that could derail you and that could be a waste of effort because they're not well aligned. Now, the next slide I'm going to jump over because you're going to have the slides anyway, but there's just a set of things that you can do. Do not waste time managing the complicated. Find simplicity. Try to simplify things, not complicate them. Set a good foundation, and don't forget that strategy is in action in radical programs. You don't have time to think about strategy. You act, and then you enact the strategy, as they call it in the academic world, which means that the strategy comes after the fact as you justify your action. What I want to emphasize is that you need to make prompt decision and astutely adapt. So not blindly, but astutely, you have to think about it based on results. Again, measure frequently, assess continually. And a quote from two people I know. I talked to you about Mike Goodhand earlier. Steve Kirk is an old friend of mine. He's an architect and a value manager, past president of Save International. And he always said, seek the best, not perfection. Perfection is the enemy of good. And in this case, when we're talking about radical programs, we're trying to solve problems quickly. We're not trying to reach perfection. So stop when you still have time. Look at the Pareto analysis. Well, we'll give you 80% of the benefits. Okay? Don't aim for 100%. So finally, in conclusion, you have to think, have you encountered radical situations? If yes, what was the strategy? Was there a compelling leader? What were the values that were promoted? Was there a clear direction? Were decisions delegated or centralized? And what tactics and approaches were applied? And I encourage you to think about those things, because based on what I just presented and what you've lived, you could see that maybe things could have been done differently. And finally, sharing a last thought from Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who's known as the father of modern Turkey. He basically got Turkey out of the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman background and led it into a modern country as we know it today. He said, I will lead my people by the hand along the road until their feet are sure and they know the way. Then they may choose for themselves and rule themselves. Then my work will be done. So as a radical program manager, it's not for you to do everything. You have to show the way. You have to clarify the values. You have to talk about motivation. You have to choose your right catalyst, the right people that will be there, and then let them do their job and take your hands off. That's what it means. So I'm open now to questions. You have here my details, including the LinkedIn QR code. And don't forget to give generously. This is the QR code for CARE. You've seen it a few times today. But even more important than listening to all of us, it's about you helping the people in need. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michel. That was wonderful. We've got some really great questions. I'll share this first one from my good friend Philip Isgar. Slightly different view of programs. Programs as a collection of projects. Can radical programs embrace difficult and complex projects that align and bring them together to minimize common problem areas and deliver better solutions?
Yeah, that's what I call an ad hoc program. When you already have the projects and you bring them together in a program, the key there is to ask yourselves, okay, we bring them together. Why? if you bring them together for tactical reasons, for example, because it's easier, they're in the same geographical area, and they're the same client, that's one reason. And then you have tactical objectives. But if you bring them together for more organizational objectives or strategic objectives, then you have to really think, okay, why are we creating this program? Identify the objectives and then see if the projects match the objectives. If they don't, you may have to modify the projects to match. You may even have to eliminate some projects from the program or create new projects.
Excellent.
Does that answer
Excellent.
the question?
It does beautifully.
Yeah.
That was excellent. And then we have a question from Olivier. Here we go. He's asking about the challenge of the echo chamber. If you create a base with people who agree with you, don't you introduce a confirmation bias into your programs?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And the idea is to not necessarily bring a group of people together that agree with you. As I said, you have to allow for diversity and new ideas. You have to encourage divergent ideas. And what we did, for example, in this conference, we went with people that did not necessarily agree with us. For example, I'm more of a program manager. Guillaume is more of a disciplined agile person. Merv is more of and he's very competent as an event organizer. He had the resources needed to, but we didn't necessarily, and Olivier himself also had different views, but we did not necessarily share the same views. We shared the same values. And that's, I think, what's important. As long as you share the same values, but you agree to have different views or different ways to implement them, then you're not creating, in fact, a bias, I think. But you do have to share values, I think, but that's important.
Then we have a question from Eric, who says, in a recent investor day, Elon Musk and his teams at Tesla presented their thinking process with the following steps: question, delete, simplify, accelerate, automate. Would that qualify as a radical program as you define it?
Well, it could, because first you have to question, why are we here? What are we doing? And you have to find the why. That's very important. Then delete anything that is superfluous. Eliminate waste. I mean, that's very important. And that's why we talk about simplifying. I mean, for example, in value stream consulting, we talk about eliminating waste and simplifying the process. And mostly when we think of decision entropy, when the delays you have in making decisions, you have to eliminate that as much as possible. That's how you accelerate then. Automate as much as possible, yes, but be careful of automating to a point where you don't know what's happening anymore. And mostly if you use IT systems, make sure that at least somebody in the group understand how the IT systems work. Because if you rely on automation to make choices, automation is not a decision-making process. And that we have to be careful about. And a lot of people make the mistake of automating the decision process. Now, the decision process still has to come from the people who manage. And then the automation should come into measuring and things like that and producing reports. And yes, it will accelerate, it will help, but don't automate the decision process.
Okay, very good, very good. And I have a question for you. Programs can be, they're not always, but they can be very large and very long. And I wondered if that's antithetical to the idea of radical program management. Do they have to be smaller and leaner in order to remain radical?
Well, the hope is that, and my initial slide of the agenda is that you start with a chaotic process and you eventually resolve it. So my hope would be that in a long program, it could start as radical, but at one point you would be able to manage it in a more traditional way, like a more traditional program. But I'm not saying that, and some programs have stayed radical. If we look at the crisis, for example, some of the crises we have in Africa, the wars and the famines, etc., that create migration, that creates refugees, that creates pressure on the economic on the economy of Europe, of the US, for example, the richer countries. Well, these are all cascading radical programs. You could see it as one big radical program. And that's why it's important maybe to look at the source and what are we trying to resolve here. But it's also, it could be seen as a series of smaller radical programs. So I don't know really how to answer that, but I think there is, there are radical programs that will generate more radical, but the hope is that by dealing with the radical situations, we'll be able to stabilize it at one point. And that is why I think the question why is so important. Why are we here? Why are we, why have there been so many deaths in Syria and in Turkey? I don't want to get into that because it could be a political debate, but we can ask ourselves the question. There are some answers. And Professor he met, I think, this morning in the first group, answered some of those questions with his research that he did on earthquakes in Istanbul, the possibility of an earthquake in Istanbul. But
yeah. I mean, I'm intrigued about whether radical programs are radical because of the context within which they're working or because of the way in which they work. In other words, I'm very aware, again, in large programs, they kind of build up bureaucracy a bit like arteries, and they can become extraordinarily sclerotic. So what was designed as a process for change becomes business as usual.
Well, a good example is the Australian military in 2003 or 2005, I can't remember the exact date, came up with a standard for complex projects, which is very, very close to program management concepts. And I think it's a mistake to call them complex. I think we're talking here about complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And complicated is something that has many pieces, but we can find a way around it. An airplane cockpit is complicated, for example, but it's not complex because the same buttons do the same thing all the time. I mean, what is complex is when when the plane flies, the weather, that they fly in, the other flying objects that are in the sky, the control tower, the communications they have, all these things, the relationship between the elements makes it complex. But the cockpit itself is not complex, it's complicated. What happened is that in many cases, in very large programs or projects, people mistake complicated for complex. When you have a complicated situation, you try to read a plan, you try to plan, you have some instructions to resolve the problem. Where you're and people in complicated, you need to get more data to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Because the more data you have, the easier the problem is to solve. In complex, you need to simplify. You need to actually make clear what has to be solved. And if you try to get more and more data, you're complexifying the system even more.
Yes.
So it's exactly the opposite you're doing. In a complex situation, you try to find what John Griven has called the deep simplicity, and Eli Goldratt also talked about it in his book, The Choice. Try to find, there's probably something fairly simple at the base of it. And when you're in a complicated system, you need to collect more data to solve the issue. You need plans, you need instructions, you need things. The more you have, the better, the easier it is to solve. And I think that's the main difference.
Yeah, interesting. We had an event the other day for the association, involving the pharmaceutical industry, and one of the speakers there was talking about the concept of minimum viable data, which I thought was a lovely concept, that decisions don't get made without crossing that boundary, but that boundary is minimum viable data, which seemed like a wonderful kind of approach to agile decision making. Michel, we're pretty much out of time, I think. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm hoping that everybody else watching did. I'm sure they did. We're going to take another break now, just for another 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back at 18:15 with Saurabh Bhandari, and a change of MC. So Merv is taking over from me as MC. So thank you again, Michel, and thank all of you who've been watching this afternoon. I've had an absolute blast, and it's been a real privilege to MC for these speakers and panelists. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Jonathan, for participating in the event. It was really, really nice to see you again, and glad to be collaborating with you again.
Indeed. Bye, Michel.
Bye-bye.